I'm Mak Uwalters, and I was the lead writer on Mass Effect 2. Today, we're going to be talking a lot about the development of our Dirty Dozen characters that were so integral to Mass Effect 2, but obviously to that huge suicide mission that we did at the end, and some of the things that we did to make you care about those characters and really weave their story and their narrative into that epic outcome of the second game of Mass Effect Trilogy. This Legacy Party Members doc is a living document that we would have used, I'm going to say, probably from about 3 months into development up until anywhere from 6 to 9 months going in. And we realized, one of our biggest challenges was going to be coming up with who are these 12 iconic characters who you care about enough to bring into your party and go on a suicide mission with. I think one interesting thought that we had early on was that we couldn't just make 12 new characters that were disposable. Part of the trilogy was this idea of your consequences going from game to game. So we knew it was going to, however this suicide mission was going to play out, it had to feel consequential. You can see lots of different ideas for various characters in here. And honestly, early on, we very much kind of went with that there are no bad ideas idea for coming up with pitches for the different characters. At this point, we wouldn't really necessarily even be thinking about how they would interact with each other, or even maybe how they'd interact with the player. We really just were trying to throw things at the wall and see what would stick. And there's a lot of really fun characters in here that eventually didn't make it for one reason or another, although I'm sure now that they're going to be out in the world, people will be clamoring for some of them, like the crazy Korean king. I honestly can't remember whose idea that was, though reading it, it feels like it was probably Drew's. But yeah, this idea of the crazy, someone like the crazy Irishman from Braveheart, kind of just a fun, wild, bombastic character.
You're a madman.
Another interesting one, number 16, the Mad Bomber. This demolitions expert that's just crazy. And you can kind of see elements of that morph into a bit of the convict. But I also think in some degree, elements of that also blended into Zaid eventually, just this sort of crazy, bombastic person. Obviously, drastically different characters in the end, Jack and Zaid, but you can see the inception point of some of those in here. Oh, and of course, we had a techno hippie, at one point anyway, so that was a thing. Further down in the document, you can start to see I guess I would call these sort of our early top picks, but even these, weren't final by any stretch. We have, this Solarian assassin, sounds really cool, and with the sort of the inspiration from Inigo Montoya, and I think that's an interesting point there, even is that it might seem obvious, but we take inspiration from everywhere. I always loved The Princess Bride. I love that character.
My name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die.
Another interesting shift and change is in the Korean infiltrator that we see there. And it honestly wasn't until I went back and read this that I even remembered any of the sort of early inception of it. But it was the reference to Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid that kind of caught my eye. And I realized that a lot of what we see in this sort of character details and their sort of plot line ended up morphing into Garris, and specifically into the Archangel. But honestly, early on, that's what we're looking at, is just getting those ideas out there, because you don't know what's going to be interesting. And as we go a little bit further in and further along, you'll start to notice as well that it's often not one idea that survives. And I think that's something that's really true about a lot of game design, a lot of storytelling, is that this concept of, it's one big idea and that's what makes a great game. It's like, no, it's thousands of ideas. And a lot of times they do start to all blend and weave together as you go throughout. And it was really interesting for me, actually, of course, being separated from this now by almost 10 years, going back, and I had forgotten how much these characters had morphed and evolved over time and kind of blended into each other. You can see hints of characters who would later become much more defined. So a good example would be 14, the Crusader. At this point, this is a male, and they're just called New Alien. We knew we wanted a new alien race involved in Mass Effect 2. We didn't know what they would look like. We didn't know how they would behave. And I remember having probably half a dozen meetings just on who are the Drell? What are they called? They weren't called the Drell at the time. And so it is an evolution as we go through, and each of these things tend to feed back into each other. Another good example here, if you go to 19, you see we included Garris. We also had Tali in this early version of the document. I think, we knew we wanted some of those key characters from Aspect 1 to be coming back to be part of the Dirty Dozen. We weren't sure which ones. We weren't sure how we were going to do that. If this truly was a suicide mission, what did that mean for, the beloved characters of Mass Effect 1? You can see really clear starting points for what would become Miranda. There's usually a kernel or some sort of thing, a spark for a character. And you can almost always trace that back right to the origin here, right? And that concept of not just Miranda's plot points and the fact that she worked for Cerberus and things like that, but this idea that she was genetically engineered that made her perfect, but that was also going to be her flaw. And that's kind of that spark in Miranda, that thing that's really interesting. And that remained all the way throughout. And to me, that is us telling stories about characters at our best, is when we find what those things are and we make sure they stay true throughout. Another fun example to me is the design of Krogan 3B. When I worked on Garris on Mass Effect 1, one of the things I really enjoyed about his character was his malleability. The fact that this was a character who was waiting in some regards to be shaped by a strong figure. I like that idea, and I think the design of Krogan sort of kind of grew out of that concept in a way that, what if you took that all the way to the start, like actually, from birth almost, and you could really shape that character. So the concept of the Dirty Dozen and of the suicide mission was something that I think we kind of hit on fairly early in a world where consequence and choice are so integral. What's more consequential than taking all those characters you love and putting them in a suicide mission, right? And you can even see in this document, we start to refer to things in sort of bold when we don't know what they are. At this point, we just knew that one day you'd be assailing this planet, this fortress, whatever it is, and a bunch of people would die if you didn't play your cards right. One of the interesting things that we always joked about, on a Friday was a suicide mission with, 10 or 12 of your favorite characters is creating just the most brutal future world for ourselves on Mass Effect 3. Because now you've got all of these permutations that we're going to have to deal with. And we would all just laugh and say, oh, that's for our future selves to worry about. And we did figure it out eventually. But it was, we knew it was coming. We knew the pain frame was coming at that point. It's interesting at the bottom of this document where we look at some of the top picks, you can see that we're starting to flesh out the relationship, specifically how each character's relationship with Shepard could go. It's interesting because you can start to see things in here where we're starting to talk about loyalty and how that could potentially impact, the characters and their arc. A good example is under the Young Thief. It's like if the loyalty doesn't stay up, then they'll leave. I don't think at this point we had fully figured out how loyalty would impact the end game, but we knew that it was going to be an important factor. It wasn't just a matter of find 12 people and go attack the thing. It was like, no, it's actually going to be about interact with those 12 people. They're not going to want to work well together. In fact, some of them might even want to kill each other. And if you don't do something about that, you're going to fail the mission. I think we also realized that a lot of games don't necessarily want to address the fact that, the people that you're hanging out with all don't get along. And to me, that just makes them feel more alive. Like, of course, some of these characters wouldn't get along. Of course, they'd hate each other. Of course, they'd even want to kill each other or leave if you don't do something about it. And it kind of also spoke to sort of that, leadership that comes with, the burden of being Commander Shepard. In this case, can I actually get all these people to work together towards a common goal so we don't all die in the end? And to me, I don't think we knew how powerful that would be. We guessed, and I think it worked out really well in the end. In this second document we're going to look at, we had narrowed in on, what our top characters were going to look like, really started to flesh out some of their stories a little bit more, and try to really figure out not only what their narrative would be, but how is that going to work in the game? And I think what's interesting in this document is you can see that we have now identified that there are loyalty missions and there are acquisition missions. We knew that we wanted to center a lot of the actual missions that you would go on, the actual levels of the game, around these characters. Obviously that's going to be important, and that we would divide them into those two steps. First you acquire them, and then you have the optional one to make them loyal. You'll notice that Thane was actually Creo's Than, and it was at some point, who knows when, I would have decided, no, let's actually call him Thane Creo. We're really starting to flesh out, the missions, as we're going to acquire these characters, but also a little bit more detail about who they are and what drives them, their motivations. But even at this point, you'll notice like we don't call out things like temporal syndrome for Thane. We knew that Thane was dying. That was part of his motivation, and that was going to be what really sort of drove him and meant that, you know, he would both be willing to join you and help you in this mission, but also kind of made him a really unique free agent, right? You know, a lot of times there would be characters that we might have just written a small, you know, sort of side quest for. And the great thing is too, is you can also, you know, in the case of like a Comrade Burner, you can kind of go, oh wow, fans really responded to that, let's bring them back. I'm Commander Shepard, I should be able to deal with that person or see them dealt with. And that's how, you know, I sort of had the idea to bring Nasana back in this one, because she wasn't the best person in ME1 to deal with. And in fact, actually kind of gets one over on Shepard, if I recall, in ME1. So at this point, we've come quite a way, and we're actually detailing out the different points. And we may simultaneously even have what we would call like a gray box level at this point. So very rough. This one, GR Loyalty, so that's Garris Loyalty. So we've already acquired Garris at this point, who was Archangel. And I think, you know, one of the interesting things, if you actually look at his acquisition document, there is no mention of Archangel at that point. I don't remember at what point I went, you know what would be great is if we could surprise and delight players a little bit and actually, you know, have them think they're going to get this cool sort of renegade character named Archangel, and then it turns out it's Garris, and Garris has had a lot happen in that time, and we can then sort of unpack all of that. That's what made, you know, these missions so much fun to do, and I think probably what made them so memorable for players as well. And then this whole mission just sort of reveals all this interesting stuff about them, and to me, I think that was one of the fun things about doing, you know, these missions. When we started writing the idea of the suicide mission, it's immediately apparent that obviously, you know, the characters would be critical to that, especially in a game where choice and consequence matter as much as they do. And you know, at the end of the day, if I haven't written a character that people care about and don't want to save, well, that's on me. So really, as a writer, my goal is to make you care and make you want to save that character and invest the time it would take to you know, acquire them, make them loyal, keep them loyal. And then make sure, you know, of course, in the end, you do the right thing. We knew that it had to be centered around the characters. It's a suicide mission. Their lives had to be at stake. And that we had all these sort of inputs that would tie into that. We wanted to be more complex than that. So there were all these very, very distinct inputs. Some of them are loyalty missions, some of them are on conflicts, some of them around whether you did, you know, some of those missions right at the end. When it came to actually executing that sort of final story, it's also obviously super important that you still want to bring it to a conclusion that feels satisfying and feels like it fulfilled the promise of what you set out to do. Beyond the idea of, you know, this was going to be a suicide mission, it was also, we knew it was a trilogy. So we, you know, and specifically Casey had always wanted this to be that darker middle act, you know, the Empire Strikes Back of our trilogy. And, you know, what could be darker and almost more tumultuous than, you know, an ending where you don't know the outcome, right? Like it could really change everything as far as your perspective is concerned on what's happening in the world and how you're going to proceed in the next act, right? And I think that's why, again, you know, that the suicide mission fit so well within that concept. You know, to me, what's interesting as I sort of went down this sort of nostalgic trip and tried to remember what did we do and how did we do it, there were times where I was surprised that I'd forgotten because it had been an amazing project to work on. We didn't know all the answers. We didn't know that this was going to work out. And honestly, even if you took all of those same people and said, do it again, I don't know if we would. Sometimes magic strikes, and you know, if you could point to it and go, that's how we did it, then everyone would be doing it. That's part of the magic of it, is that it was a very quick project to work on. We didn't have a lot of time to sort of second guess ourselves, and honestly, to me, that's the magic of that experience, having worked on it, and hopefully that's, you know, part of the magic that people still remember from it too.